Hello, I'm Brian Winter, the editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly and vice president for policy here at America's Society and Council of the Americas. Everyone recognizes that the United States and China is the most important bilateral relationship of the 21st century. And I know it's one that people in Latin America are watching very closely, given their country's evolving relationships with both of these great powers. Our guest today is James Falk, a veteran financial and strategic advisor who spent a decade as a senior executive at Hong Kong exchanges and clearing. That means that he's seen this US-China dynamic from the perspective of the financial markets. It's not a perspective we often hear. And he talks about it in his new book, which we have lavishly displayed here, called Financial Cold War. James, we want to cover a lot of ground and touch on some of the latest developments. Also talk about how all this relates to Latin America, talk a little bit perhaps about the Ukraine war as well. But I'd like to start first by welcoming you and by asking you to talk a little bit about your life story. You grew up in Hong Kong. How did you find yourself at the center of this critical dynamic?
Thank you very much, Brian, for having me here speak today. My story is very typical of a lot of people from Hong Kong. So mixed Chinese-British family, grew up in Hong Kong, got chucked off to boarding school in the UK, age 10, then ended up going to university in Beijing for a bit and landed back working as an investment banker in London. Did that for a bunch of time, then eventually went home to Hong Kong in 2008, where I ultimately ended up advising the Hong Kong Exchange on acquiring the London Metal Exchange in 2012 and ended up working there for 10 years, during which time Hong Kong Exchange was at the center of doing a lot of the capital markets internationalization initiatives for China, the Stock Connect, On Connect program, which have been massive in terms of integrating China's capital markets into the rest of the world. It was just a really fascinating place to be. And I certainly learned a lot from that time.
James, many people in Latin America are convinced that we're headed towards a new Cold War between Beijing and Washington, between China and the United States. But in your book, you explicitly reject that idea. Why?
I do. And I think that the characterization of the Sino-US tensions today as a new Cold War is one that is very dangerous. Firstly, because the circumstances between China and America today are vastly different to those between the United States and the Soviet Union in the 1940s. In the 1940s, there was no commercial trade or financial relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. So disengagement, which was effectively the strategy that was used by both sides through the Cold War, was something which meant that neither side really had anything to lose. China and the US are so intertwined today through trade, through financial investment, that any attempt at decoupling would be economically disastrous to both countries and would likely only exacerbate the types of tension that have arisen between the two countries. And when you look at this kind of Cold War narrative, the reality is that actually what I focus on in the book is what are the sources of tension? What are the root causes of the tensions that have arisen? Of course, there are lots of different dimensions to great power relationships, but the financial dynamics between the two countries, driven by the structure of the international financial system and the financial policies that both countries have pursued, have significantly contributed to these tensions. And this is something which is not generally particularly well understood.
So it may not be a new Cold War, but it's clear that something has changed in the last 10, 15, 20 years. I mean, this idea, all of these ideas that we saw at the turn of the century about growing cooperation and convergence between China and the United States, the possibility that China would become increasingly more kind of liberal and democratic. that's gone, at least for the moment, and you talk a little bit about this in your book. It's been replaced by what, at the very least, could be described as a rivalry. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, it certainly seems that the governments in Beijing and Washington both see it that way.
Look, I mean, competition between countries is quite a normal thing. Actually, in many ways, it's healthy because it pushes both societies to improve themselves, to innovate. And that's generally better for humanity as a whole. But when there's good competition, and then there's bad competition, when the bad competition veers towards the types of populist nationalism that you've seen arising in both countries with respect to their attitudes towards each other, then that becomes very dangerous.
Mm-hmm. The subtitle of your book, which I'm going to sort of shamelessly hawk once again, it's A View of Sino-U.S. Relations from the Financial Markets. Tell me, I mean, we've just described this, whatever we would call it, a rivalry, confrontation, kind of in general terms. What is it that your time in Hong Kong in the financial markets taught you about the nature of this confrontation?
We have this saying in Cantonese, which directly translates into "it's like the chicken talking to the duck."
Okay, unpack that one.
The meaning of the phrase is effectively the talking at cross purposes. Through my work at Hong Kong Exchange, I had the good fortune to work very closely with policymakers in mainland China, Hong Kong, in the United States, and around the world. And my observation was that at many points in time, or quite often, the two sides are often talking at cross purposes to each other, largely because they don't understand necessarily where each other are coming from. And it leads to a level of suspicion about motives. Actually, myself, I've been guilty of that. I remember in 2013, when we were negotiating the Shanghai-Hong Kong Stock Connect thing, I found myself sitting in a room with my opposite number at the Shanghai Stock Exchange in heated discussion. And I was getting quite frustrated with him. It was a discussion about a point of implementation of this scheme. And I was frustrated because what I was pushing for was international market practice. And I just thought that Fu Hao, who's a very sensible guy, just didn't understand. Mm. Then he turned around to me and said, "But why do you think that we should do it your way?" I said, "Look, this is international practice. This is how it's done everywhere in the world." And he turned to me and he said, "But why?" And actually, to my shame, I suddenly realized that it wasn't that he didn't understand, it was that he looked at it, he didn't agree. And I couldn't explain why it was done that way. It just was done that way. I just kind of assumed that it would be done that way, hadn't really thought about why. And I certainly couldn't explain what the practice was in mainland China. I had no idea. So I think that the moral of that story for me was that you have to be much more open-minded in engaging. And it certainly pushed me to do a lot more work to try and understand where both sides were coming from in what the work that I was doing.
So whether the rivalry is overstated or the result of misunderstandings or miscommunications, it's real. And governments all over the world, and in particular Latin America, are focused on trying to figure out how to navigate this. And for Latin America, it's tricky because the U.S. is traditionally the largest trading partner. It still is, although by a shrinking margin. China's number 2, looking at the region as a whole. But that's largely because of U.S.-Mexico trade. If you take Mexico out, and if you look at South America, China's role becomes much more important. It's the largest trading partner already for countries as diverse as Brazil and Chile and Peru, and I think now Uruguay as well. So, again, based on your position from Hong Kong, your experience over these last 10 years, what advice do you have for countries? And here I refer to both governments and kind of investors and private sector. What advice do you have for people who are trying to figure out how to navigate these changing waters right now?
Countries in Latin America face many of the same challenges as countries in Southeast Asia, across Europe. They want to trade and do business with both the United States and with China. They don't want to pick sides. The competition where it's forcing people to stand on one side or another is something which countries across Latin America don't want to do, and they don't want to do it in Southeast Asia. But in order to be able to forge an independent path, particularly smaller countries need to band together with other countries, which enables them to protect themselves where some countries are exercising their power to push them in a particular direction that they don't want to go. My advice simply would be, look, there's no reason not to be on good terms with the United States. There's no reason not to be on good terms with China. And hopefully both can coexist and do business in Latin America.
There's an increasing dynamic, which I recently wrote about for Foreign Affairs magazine, about this idea, some call it active non-alignment. This is an idea that is shared by many political thinkers, foreign policy strategists, interestingly, on both the ideological left and the ideological right in Latin America, which in a sense is more or less the strategy that you just outlined, which is trying to essentially strike a middle ground and maintain good relationships with both. Do you think it's possible, though? I mean, I do think that we're still 5 years, 10 years out going to be in a world where it's possible to strike that middle ground?
It's become very difficult. Look, if you look at what's happening in Ukraine and the consequences of that, I think it highlights precisely the issues. If you read the English language media, there's huge criticism of countries like China for not joining in Western sanctions on Russia. The fact is that China is not an outlier here.
That's right.
The reality is that people look at the course of events and the sources of conflict that have resulted in the tragedy that is unfolding in Ukraine right now. And many countries have a very different view. India has chosen not to go along with these sanctions. Brazil has chosen not to go along with these sanctions. I think you have to think about the fact that these so-called international community that have levied these sanctions on Russia account for only 10 to 15% of the world's population. They're actually not in the majority here. Mm-hmm. And then when you look at the use of financial sanctions, this is something that, coming from the financial markets, it particularly worries me, because financial sanctions can be very unpredictable. In conventional warfare, there's this established principle of non-combatant immunity. No such rule exists in financial warfare. So the first order effects of this set of sanctions on Russia were a spike in oil prices. They were a short-term run on the ruble. Subsequently, you've seen violent protests break out in Sri Lanka over fuel price inflation. Sri Lanka's got absolutely nothing to do directly whatsoever with what's going on in Ukraine, but they're getting sideswiped by these sanctions. There will inevitably be third-order effects right now. The freezing of Russia's foreign exchange reserves is an unprecedented move. When you think about the rest of the world, particularly export nations across Asia, Latin America, and so forth, they're selling their commodities and they're selling their labor in return for dollars, and they're accumulating savings. If they lose confidence that they will be able to access those savings on a rainy day, or if they happen to get into conflict with the West, are they still going to be willing to sell their goods? Are they still going to be willing to sell their labor in return for dollars? And if they are not, what are the consequences on inflation in the developed world? And what are the consequences of that on social stability? Once you open that particular can of worms, it is very dangerous.
What if, though, and then recognizing that what's happening right now is broadly speaking not good, at least in the short term, for economic growth for many countries, for financial flows, and so on. What if we are heading toward a world that is less globalized than it was before? This idea of deglobalization, where we have more regional blocks, essentially, and that what this war is signaling is the early stages of a separation that perhaps started with the COVID-19 pandemic and the realization in the United States and elsewhere that perhaps this country was too dependent on critical elements of its supply chain being in Asia, and that resulted in very clear shortages of the personal protective equipment that we needed during those stages. I mean, do you think that's where we're headed? And if so, what kind of implications does that have for a region like Latin America, where countries may, at the end of the day, have to choose, because that's kind of the way the world order is heading?
I think you have to separate different issues in that. So there's a question of prudent risk management around supply chains. And we've seen through the COVID-19 pandemic that clearly many corporations operating internationally were not prudently managing their risk that were inherent, the risks that were inherent in their supply chains. That's an issue that certainly needs to be dealt with. But then when you get to this issue of decoupling or deglobalization, you've got to remember that globalization has offered many scale benefits, which have ultimately grown the pie for everyone. Now, you can quibble, and I do this in my book, about the inequity of the distribution of that pie. But the answer is not to make the pie smaller, because actually, if there's even less to go around, the likelihood is that it's going to exacerbate the social tensions that we've got.
Right. What's your sense of how Latin America is perceived from China?
Look, very frankly, there are a bunch of people in the diplomatic sphere who think about it. There are a bunch of corporations active in commodities purchases who think about it. But for most ordinary people in the street in China, then when they think about the world, they naturally think about America, they think about Europe, they think about their neighborhood in Asia. Latin America is not necessarily front and center of mind for most people in China.
I mean, the same could be true to some extent here in the United States, of course, too. Most people don't walk around thinking about foreign policy on a day-to-day basis. At the same time, one thing that always strikes me about this question, about the idea of how China sees Latin America, the region that we think about all the time here at American Society and the Council of the Americas, is how far away it is. The three global capitals that are furthest from Beijing are Montevideo, Buenos Aires, and Brasilia. I mean, it's just very distant. So, you know, I suppose from a financial market perspective, is it seen as, kind of leaving everyday people out of it, is it seen as a critical venue for both the competition for resources and to some extent influence, or is it kind of on the same level as say, Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, which I know is also very important to the Chinese policy?
The Chinese are very pragmatic in their interactions with the rest of the world. We think about China as a large exporter, but the reality is that China is a large re-exporter. The input commodities that go into China's exports are imported. And critically, China is not self-sufficient for either food or fuel, energy. And so China has to go out to Latin America, places like Chile, Argentina, to buy copper, to buy soybeans. Likewise, has to go out to places like Africa. And in China's development model, they've chosen not to try and impose the Chinese system on other countries. Unlike the West, in its development model internationally, it very much pushes Western morality and the Western system of governance on other countries, whether it's appropriate for those countries or whether they're ready for it or not. When I look at Chinese development, I so happen to have had the good fortune to spend some time in East Africa. You go to East Africa, you have a lot of Chinese presence there. They're building roads, they're building train networks, and they're doing it because of the practical need they have to access commodities, to purchase them, to get them out to port, to ship them. And they're not questioning whether those countries have a governance model that they like. They're not questioning whether they hew to a particular kind of Chinese morality in their society. They're just building the roads, they're building the ports, they're building the train networks. And at the end of it, okay, you may criticize that, but if you're sitting in Kenya and you're looking at it, hey, Chinese have come, I now have a road.
Right.
I think that we ought to give credit where credit's due, and I think that Chinese investment overseas has not always been benign. It's in many places led to certain sensitivities, but a lot of good has come from it as well.
It's interesting, though, to see polling from, say, I believe it's Pew Research that has done polling on this, that shows that negative views of China are increasing pretty fast, not only in the West, but in some of these places where investment has been very strong these last couple of years.
I think when you think about this, and this is where it ties to the capital markets, China has a huge amount of savings. There are 35 trillion US dollars sitting in Chinese bank deposits today. That is the largest untapped pool of capital in the world. China is also aging very fast. And in order to defray the government's social welfare spending burden in the future, China needs to get some of that savings into capital markets to generate better returns. China's own capital markets are not yet fully developed. And while they're very large, they're not large enough to absorb that amount of capital, not at least in a short time without generating huge asset price bubbles. And so China needs to find a way of getting that money out into the rest of the world. The problem for China is that when a Chinese citizen invests his or her money in international capital markets outside of China beyond Hong Kong, he or she is entirely dependent on a Western-controlled financial infrastructure of payment networks, of depositories, of custodians. And if you look at the way in which the West has imposed sanctions on Russia after 2014, the main way of affecting these sanctions is through those infrastructures. And Chinese policymakers have simply taken a look at this and said, look, we need to get this capital out, but we can't possibly put ourselves at that kind of financial security risk. So they're stuck with this model where they're forced to go out through Chinese companies. So Chinese companies, quite often state-owned, have to go and buy companies in other places. They have to buy assets in other places. And you've seen this through the Belt and Road Initiative. This foreign direct investment inevitably leads to sensitivities around Chinese government influence, Chinese government control, level of technology transfer, jobs transfer, and so forth. But the problem is that China has very limited other ways of getting that capital out. If 1,000 Mrs. Wangs from Chongqing were able to come and buy a few shares of Alphabet or Amazon, nobody's going to care.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The most, I guess, the best known case of Chinese investment in Latin America has been in Venezuela over these last couple of years, these were investments that did end up in practice allowing or supporting the dictatorship of Nicolás Maduro. And I think that's part of the reason why there's perhaps been a downturn in some of the polling of Chinese image in the region these last couple of years. Tell me, James, as we wrap this up, I'm just curious, what's the one thing that the West, and I specifically, not only people in the United States, but perhaps people in Latin America as well, what's the one thing that people in the West get most wrong about China?
They expect the Chinese to be exactly like them. China comes from a very different historical context, and so it has different ways of doing things. If you're going to rub along well, then you just have to accept these differences. It's like friends. I may not agree with everything that my friend believes in, but where we have commonality, we embrace the commonality, and where we have differences, we just agree to disagree. I think that's as simple as it is.
Okay. Well, James, thank you so much for being with us today. And then thank you to our viewers for joining us as well.
Thank you very much, Brian.